Well, by the time that this video has gone live, the new Exorcist movie, Believer, will be in theaters, and the world will know just how successful, or, well, floppy that it is. But in honor of that, I figured it was time to rank up the previous films in the series, but there's not enough of them to stand on their own, so we thought it would be fun to put them up against the Omen films. There's 5 of each, so it's an even 10 films, the perfect showdown. And actually, this concept was suggested years ago by my friend Mike Forshaw, and it was just a matter of finding the right time for it. And I think that time is now. So here's the movies that are involved. And I sent this list to my patrons, and I got a record number of participants. These guys all answered the call and sent me their list of these movies with their favorite film at number 1, worth 1 point, and their least favorite in dead last. Here, 10th place, worth 10 points. And I then added up all those points to give us the definitive ranked version of these two series. And I'll be honest, the results on the top half of this list are pretty expected. So I'm going to switch things up this month, and we're going to go in reverse order. We're starting with our number 1 movie and counting down to our worst film, our dead last.
Are you ready, Reagan?
Yes.
Before we start, I should say that I got 49 rankings this time around, which means that the best score that a movie could have is 49 points, and the worst it could have is 490. So, coming in at number 1 with a bullet, or crucifix in this case, I think everyone knows what's going on here, and it was a landslide victory, because with 73 points, we have The Exorcist. The lowest score that it got was 5th place, which only took 1 time. But it was in 1st place 33 times. That's right, 2/3 of the rankings put this movie in 1st place. And I mean, I was one of those number 1s, because let's face it, this is one of the greatest horror films of all time. I remember taking a long time to see this one. Everyone talked it up and said that it was the scariest thing that they had ever seen, and that it had made them pee their pants. And I just kept putting it off. And then, one Halloween, I was by myself. My mom had gone somewhere or something, and I was just at home. I gave out the candy, and then when that was done, I just went and started watching TV. And The Exorcist came on. So I figured, why not? Let's do it. The Exorcist on Halloween. Perfect. I got to the backwards talking on the tape and noped out. I know the times change and audience tolerance changes, but I really think this one holds up. If you watch this today for the first time, even after all the knockoffs, even after everything in it has been parodied and copied and turned into pop culture tropes, it still exudes creepiness. And, you know, I really think there's a huge difference between this film and any modern exorcism tale, and that's subtlety. Like sure, I think that most people don't think of the freaking Exorcist when you talk about subtle films, but it's more low-key than you think. There's no flashy editing and blinking lights and loud noises and all the other tricks that everybody seems to think is, oh, so spooky. Even apparently the makers of Believer. But some of the more off-putting elements in this movie are quiet and toned down. It's just a far more restrained film than you're thinking. And when it goes big, it goes big. It's one of the most well-known horror films for a reason. And that's because it's one of the best. And if we ever did a whole let's rank all the number 1 movies from all the Dead Last episodes thing, I'd put good money on this one coming on top there too.
I am no one. Is a priest.
I'll admit that I thought that 2nd place was a lock, but it was pretty close there for a while, as 2 films really battled it out for the silver medal spot. But the last day of rankings ensured this film's 2nd place spot with 110 points, and it's going to be the original version of The Omen. The lowest score that it got was a single 7th place nod, and it took the 1st place spot 11 times. So between The Exorcist and The Omen, Those two films take up 44 of the first place votes, leaving only 5 of the 49 remaining. And I put this one in third, and hell yeah, the original Omen is a solid flick. And keep in mind, this was when the whole world was jumping on Exorcist ripoffs and doing the whole satanic horror thing. But the Omen took a bit of a different tactic and does what it does very well. I mean, at the core, they're both about kids and a satanic force and a small child, but they couldn't be more different in their presentations. Like the concept of dealing with the Antichrist and its ties to a more traditional religious tale, as opposed to a full on demon possession, sets it apart. And it may not have as many memorable standout moments like The Exorcist, but it still manages to give you some unique bits. Like for one thing, I think that the scene with the nanny hanging herself is just one of those unsettling moments that doesn't get a ton of attention. And of course, the decapitation scene is one of the all-time greats. Keep in mind, that type of elaborate death sequence wasn't a thing at that point. It was still a novelty. And the thing is that the overall subtlety is perhaps the film's greatest strength and also its greatest weakness, because whereas it has this more understated feeling and more down-to-earth vibe that makes it all more real, it just sometimes feels a little too standard and I guess not special. And meanwhile, the idea that they would run a big front page photo of the dead priest is pretty insane. Like, hey, this dude just died in a really horrible way. Check out this big picture of it. Ain't it neat? Plus, the mom falling scene will never not be hilarious. Like, look at this. I'm sure that this is one of those shots that was cool at the time and simply aged poorly because we found better ways to accomplish the same general thing. But it's just goofy. And look, I think this movie's great. But I'm not going to lie, it sort of loses momentum with the whole overseas trip. The more interesting bits are at home with the kid and what's unveiling there. But instead, we have to see this whole side mission and have to follow Dad and David Warner as they globetrot and unveil the mystery. But maybe it's just me, but I'm thinking, like, can we get back to the demon kid, please?
Look at me, Damien. It's all for you.
So this next one, like I said, was close for a while, really going for second place, but then just lost that momentum on the last day and ended up in third place. But with a still respectable 159 points, we're looking at The Exorcist III Legion. This did manage to get one dead last ranking, but took first place 5 times, the remainder of the firsts. From this point on, no films received any first place votes. And I was rooting for this one to take the second place spot because it was my second place choice because, wow, what a freaking sequel this is. There's just so many little details that make this great. And there's this constant sense of uneasiness and oddball characters. I know that I've talked before on Dead Lasts about how important that atmosphere is when it comes to horror movies. And this one is a textbook example. From the get-go, there's just this world that's being built up that feels real and unique. The way that characters interact with each other, the sounds you hear, everything is just this cohesive thing. Plus, that scene in the hallway. It's just one of the most perfectly executed jump scares in all of cinema. But it's more than that. It's quality filmmaking and a great example of misdirection. Like, first of all, it's mostly one unbroken shot, and it just lets everything build, and you're so far away from it all that you feel kind of safe, but the tension just builds, and the nurse is just checking rooms, and there's a security guard there, so everything is cool. But then she goes into that room, and he gets up and leaves, so you think that it's now set up for her next encounter to be the scare, and she comes out of that room, so that room is safe. But then the danger comes from that room where you're not expecting it from. Plus, it's so interesting because it doesn't feel anything like the original film, but it's also clearly connected. But here's my issues with it. The ending has to force the exorcism. They just had to have an exorcism and did an entire reshoot to ensure it. So then you have to bring in this priest that hasn't mattered to the story at all. And then it's a face-off with a demon that hasn't been there either. So you have this showdown with a priest we don't really know versus a demon that we haven't focused on for the whole film, And this movie's about Kinderman and the Gemini killer. So the exorcism just feels like a box to check. And we don't get a resolution to the story that we've been following for the entire rest of it. That being said, I've seen the original cut without the exorcism that follows the book ending, and I admit that didn't really work either. So it's clear the ending needed something, but I guess just not this. Also, I'll never not think that the Golden Girl pulling her granddaughter's head away from death is silly. And that'll take us out of our top 3, and our number 4 movie had a pretty big drop down in points. But on this episode, that's a bad thing since we're going backwards. But coming in with 213 points, over 50 points more than The Exorcist III, we're looking at Damien, the Omen II. Like Legion, this was also ranked in dead last one time, but didn't get any number 1s. And its best score was second place, which it got twice. And I had this one right where it landed since I had it in 4th place. And I like this, but man, am I kind of conflicted with it because for as interesting as the beginning of this film is, it's like it just gives up halfway through. There's this whole moment where Damien realizes who he is and runs outside in despair. And that's just such a great idea. And the whole notion of someone being faced with the reality that they're the freaking Antichrist. And it sets up a really compelling second half. It seems like it's establishing this whole battle within himself to either come to terms with his destiny or deny it. I mean, think about what a complete and total mind screw that had to be to find out that you're the damn Antichrist, the child of the devil himself. And that sounds like a really juicy story to sink your teeth into. But then, like, one scene later, and he's all just like, oh yeah, I'm fine now. And he's settled into his role with no issues. Like, the entire concept of wrestling with his future and ending the world is settled over the course of an edit. Then, the whole rest of the film is just a rote kind of who cares repeat of the first, with someone trying to determine his true identity and stop him, but Damien has to use his powers or followers to kill them, and even though that amounts to a smattering of fun, it's just not really that interesting. It's rescued by one outstanding showstopper of a death scene, though, with that elevator bit. Like, for a film series that seems to have this reputation of having these Rube Goldberg-style murder sequences, they're actually kind of few and far between. But this one alone seems to cement that reputation. And it's spectacular. Moving on up to our number 5 movie on this ranking, and this was another big increase because we rocketed up almost 60 points to 272. And it's another Omen entry with The Final Conflict. This never got any dead last rankings, but it did get a 9th place nod, and the best score that it got was 2nd place, which it took twice. And here's where I get controversial, I guess, because I had this one down in 7th, because I don't really like this one. I mean, it's fine and all. It's not like I think that it's a bad movie or anything, but it just doesn't really appeal to me. The biggest issue with this one is that the entire concept of an adult Antichrist who is evil and knows it just isn't as interesting as the concept of that evil in the body of a child coming to terms with it. Like, I feel like there was no need to jump ahead like 20 years, since that basically took the whole concept of what made the original so unique and threw it away in favor of typical evil old guy stuff. And then they combine that with having no plot. It's literally just a string of instances, and occasionally someone tries to kill Damien and he defeats them until the end. The only time that this one gets really wild and memorable is when they kill off a bunch of babies. Like, a bunch. And that's not something you normally see in a Hollywood picture, and it was a pretty bold move. But the other thing is that there was always something more subversive to these movies. Evil won. Damien won. There was a weird guilty pleasure in seeing this evil kid with everyone out to get him because of what he represents, but he still came out on top. Evil won. It kind of softened the whole religious parable aspect of these, but then this one kind of doubles down on it. It removes all the subtlety. It just feels like a cop-out. That being said, the character of Damien just isn't that appealing here, even though it's Sam Neill playing it. But it's not like you're really rooting for him anyway, because again, here, He's just like a generic super evil villain.
I will drive deeper the thorns into your rancid carcass, you profaner of vices.
Heading on down closer to the bottom of this list, and we're getting to the rougher end of things as we go on to our number 6 movie, and it dropped a massive 70 plus points from Omen 3, and with 345 points, it's Exorcist II: The Heretic. I want to point out that so far, no movie has had more than a single dead last vote, but this one had 7 of them. And the best score that it reached was 3rd place, which it got 1 time. And I had this one right around where it landed because it was my number 5. And this one is just one of those rare films that is just such a failure in every aspect. Everything about it is wrong, but it's wrong in just the right way to make it totally entertaining. This movie's wonky, and by all accounts, this should have worked. I mean, it should have, but I guess it may have been obvious why it didn't. You're making a follow up to one of the most horrifying films of all time, and it was an understated and yet shocking terror flick. So, what's the obvious thing to do? Sci-fi glass rooms and hypno lights, of course. And I mean, I want to say that it had John Borman, so it should have been great because Deliverance and Point Blank. But he had just done Zardoz, so who knows? I mean, it's not like they weren't aware that this was a man who was capable of utter lunacy. Also, it had an insane cast with Richard Burton, Louise Fletcher, and James Earl Jones stepping in. So the cast list was certainly stacked, but it's never really sure with what to do with any of them. Or I suppose they did know what to do with James Earl Jones, and that was to put him in some sort of bug suit and have him roar directly into the camera. You know, as you do. I do admit that it starts to wear out its welcome as it goes further on, though the finale feels like it's part of an entirely different film. And then it starts to have this weird sort of tension between the older priest and Regan, and I'm not sure that it's a fatherly love kind of thing, and it just feels a bit icky. But I guess that's par for the course with this one. And look, if you have this one as your dead last, I get it. I completely get it. It's not a good movie by any stretch of the imagination. Trust me, I've stretched imaginations as far as they'll go because you'll be surprised at the tensile strength of those suckers. Getting worse now, and this was super close. Our number 7 movie was only 1 point away from The Exorcist II. It was a squeaker, and believe it or not, but the very last ranking switched their places. But with 346 points, we have the Omen remake from 2006. This bad boy was put into dead last spot 8 times, one more than The Exorcist II, and also had its highest score being 3rd place, but it got 3 of them. But I wasn't one of those 3 because this guy was my dead last. And you know what? So much has been said about how silly that the shot for shot Psycho remake is. But really, how is this any different? It does nothing new, takes no chances, and all of its best bits are just redone versions of the original, but done with less style or charm. I mean, at least the Psycho remake was upfront with its nature. It came right out and said that's what it was doing. This one presents itself as a remake, something new, and then just basically matches whatever the original did. It's as lifeless as a film as possible. And it's even more egregious when you watch it after seeing the original. You get about halfway through and you wonder, what was the point of this? Was it just like, well, people won't watch the old one anymore because it's old, but we can't make something better, so let's just make it again with trendier stars? And I've said a few times in the past that bad movies that entertain me usually get ranked a bit higher, and bad movies that bore me get ranked lower than those. But movies that outright frustrate me get put down the lowest. And this did exactly that. It was just shouting its laziness directly into my face, screaming, I can't be bothered to try something else or even really add anything, so I'm just doing the Omen again and calling it a remake. The only nice thing that I can say about it is that at least it looks like Julia Stiles falls from a distance that would actually hurt somebody. But also, how are you going to build an entire movie about a little kid that's pure evil and then cast a kid that looks like his highest level of nastiness is farting and blaming the dog? Okay, the stakes were high, and the competition was fierce as these last couple of stinkers battled it out. And there's 3 movies to go, and 2 of them that remain are Exorcist prequels. But where will they land? Well, here's a tip because our number 8 movie with 376 points, I guess the winner of the Exorcist prequel face-off is Dominion, the prequel to The Exorcist. It got 7 dead last votes, pretty comparable to our last 2 movies. And the best score it got was also 3rd place, with 1 person placing it there. And I have this one right where it belongs since this was my 8th place movie as well. And I guess I should tell you what this is first, just in case you didn't know. But they decided that what they wanted to make was a prequel to The Exorcist and make a movie about Father Merrin's previous encounter with the demon that he discussed in the original. They hired Paul Schrader, who was a pretty solid filmmaker that made Cat People, American Gigolo, and then right before this made the critically acclaimed Autofocus. And then he made this movie. Well, turns out the test audiences and the studio hated it, and they thought it was dull and not scary. So they fired Schrader and brought in Rennie Harlin to replace him. Well, Rennie wanted to go in a different direction and did extensive reshoots, like really extensive, to the point that they were 2 different movies. And there was a possibility this version would just go on a shelf somewhere, like it was Commissioner Gordon's daughter or something. But then, as it turned out, Harlan's version bombed, which delighted Schrader, who said, This is bad. If it stays this bad, I bet I can get mine resurrected. I don't know what he sounds like. And he did. They released this version straight to video shortly after, and everyone finally got to see the version that they weren't supposed to. And were shocked to find out that, yeah, it was like maybe about 7.5% better. Like the opening scene in 1944 has a lot of promise, and it has more suspense and intrigue than all of the beginning. But then it just drops off a cliff. But the biggest problem here is that it seems like someone forgot to tell Schrader that he was making an Exorcist film, since this movie doesn't feel like it's a part of that series, or even understand what made the first movie so impactful. It's aiming to be some sort of drama, I suppose, and there's nothing in this that even gives off a creepy vibe. As opposed to the movies here that leave you with this feeling of uneasiness, this is just a pretty run-of-the-mill atmosphere. Like, one of the biggest things that bugged me as well was the character of Cheche? Cheche? I don't know how you say that. Because he's supposed to have some sort of facial deformity going on. But the makeup is so utterly unconvincing that as soon as I saw it, I said, oh, okay, that's going to change over the course of the movie, and he'll look restored later on. And guess what? He did. Only 2 movies left, and one of them has to be dead last. But this one, our number 9, is not that. No, with a whopping 397 points, 21 more than Dominion, it's the other Exorcist prequel, Exorcist the Beginning. It got the dead last spot 9 times, the highest amount so far, but only managed to get 1 4th place vote. And this one was my 9th place vote, and I have to tell you, I had a hard time deciding which to put in my dead last, this or the Omen remake. Like, I know that I said about putting movies that frustrate me down lower, and boy, oh boy, did this one frustrate me and annoy me. But I guess the laziness of that one beat this one out in the end. And I know I already told the story of this one when I talked about Dominion, but yeah, this was a second take on the story. And the weird thing is that when you watch them back to back, there's so little left of the original version that you wonder why they just didn't scrap the whole thing and start over. Like, why hinder yourself with footage that remains from a version you don't like and be forced to incorporate it? Well, that's just one of about 100 poor decisions with this one, and about 50 of those all involve the hyenas. I mean, don't get me wrong, the hyenas are terrible in Dominion too, but keep in mind, they were an afterthought there. This movie had the full attention of an FX team and the full power of the budget behind them. And this is what they came up with? Like, at least in Dominion, you know that the hyenas weren't finished before they scrapped the film. And when they decided to release it anyway, they scraped up a meager budget to complete the CGI. And they look like CGI things that would be in this era of straight to DVD movies. So they're appropriate, but these were theatrical effects from the effects A team. But none of that stuff is even the biggest issue with this one. No, the biggest issue with this film is that it has no flavor. The reason why the original film is so great is the atmosphere. I've said it before, I'm saying it again. That feeling of dread. This movie has none of that. It might as well be a movie of the week. And in the end, I just can't get over the fact that they took Schrader's movie and said it was too dry and not that scary. And I mean, they were right. But then they went ahead and made this movie that's way too dry and not that scary instead. And here we go, our dead last, the worst of this batch, as opposed to the best. And I have to tell you, this was a tough competition. For a while, it looked like this might be close, but it ended up not being too narrow of a margin, since with a solid 405 points, it's the Omen IV, The Awakening. It was put in dead last 16 times, and the best score that it got was 4th place, which it took 1 time. And here it is, possibly my most controversial pick. I had this as my number 6, and I'm gonna refer you to what I said earlier. If I think that a movie is bad but entertaining, it's gonna land above those that are either boring or frustrating. And this movie is bad, but it's pretty damn fun. And maybe it's because the previous 3 movies take themselves so seriously that by the time that I got to this one, I was looking for something a little more self-aware and lighthearted. Like, after all the moodiness and dour vibes, I enjoyed this more than I should from a level of cheese. Plus, I mean, the little girl is pretty awesome, and she clocks an elementary school kid with a lunchbox. That scene alone guaranteed I wouldn't have this in my dead last. Look at this. Look at it again. Look at it one more time. And she's played by Asia Vieira, and she seems to be having a blast, just eviling it up. And she comes off as a creepier little kid than the remake Omen, that's for damn sure. Plus, the psychic fair scene alone is worth the price of admission. It's just so over the top and hilarious, and then Michael Lerner comes in and just steals the entire show, and he rocks all over this movie. But then you get this other highlight of lunacy with his death scene. Like, it's more than the whole wrecking ball thing, which is pretty glorious, but this man gets an actual chorus of dead folk singing him the theme music to the movie before he goes. And like Exorcist II, I can understand if you have this as your dead last. Me placing it in 6th place doesn't mean I think it's a good movie. But honestly, if you're giving me this and the movies I've ranked below it and said you have to watch one of these right now, I'm putting this one on because at least I know that I'm going to have some fun. So there you have it, the Exorcist movies versus the Omens. And let's take a look at this roster here. And I guess the Omen films did a little better since they had 3 films in the top 5 versus the Exorcist II. But an Omen film got dead last, and the total points, let's look at the total points. Total points for The Exorcist was 1,350, whereas the Omen films got 1,383. and 46. So in terms of how the films were ranked, they were very, very close. But the Omen movies snuck by again in terms of total points. So I guess in the overall battle between these two franchises, the Omen is the victor. But let us know how you would rank these down below in the comments. Which of these is your favorite? Do you think that the Exorcist series on a whole is better than the Omen series on a whole? Do you think that the individual films are better? Which is your favorite? I want to hear that down below in the comments, how you would have ranked these. And you can rank these if you go to patreon.com/movietimelines and become a patron for as little as $1 a month. We do this every single month with a roster of movies that people rank and send them in. You can be a part of that just by going to Patreon and doing that. Or you can just continue to liking these videos. If you enjoy the channel, of course, subscribe. That always helps as well, too. And keep on coming back because we've got lots more videos coming. And I appreciate you watching, and we'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.